A simple woman just came to say goodbye, but within minutes she was humiliated. Pushed into the sea in front of 400 elite guests by the woman who stole her husband, until a billionaire dove in. What happened next destroyed reputations, shattered empires, and crowned a queen. Stay with me. This is a story you'll remember for life. Before we begin, comment below where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary afternoon on the Amalfi Coast, but it ended with a roar that echoed across the internet and into the hearts of millions. The Valerian Five cut through the waves like a floating palace, 400 feet of marble, teak, and gold. It wasn't just a yacht, it was a statement, an altar to excess, moored for one night of celebration, a grotesque festival of power draped in satin and diamonds. The sky, a perfect Mediterranean blue, barely rivaled the shimmer of the ocean it touched. Guests floated in curated laughter, their conversations half whispers of billion-dollar mergers and scandalous divorces. Security moved like shadows, all earpieces and sharp eyes. Cameras hovered like hawks. Everyone who was anyone was there for one reason: the engagement of Sebastian Hale, the youngest CEO in Hale Corporation's history, and Aubrey Langford, supermodel turned symbol of dominance. They were the couple of the decade, picture perfect, ruthless, and today was their coronation. And then Elena Hart stepped onto the deck. She didn't belong, not by their standards, not in that $15 white cotton dress, bought in a Lisbon flea market, not with those canvas shoes creased, worn, honest, not with that face unpainted, hair undone, and eyes like something ancient had set up camp behind them. She was out of place, and yet, somehow, she wasn't. Her presence disrupted something, like a truth crashing into a lie so seamless. It almost hurt. Eyes turned, conversations halted. Aubrey's scarlet gown shifted. Sebastian's fingers tightened around his champagne. But Elena walked with purpose, not with defiance. Not with pride, but with something more dangerous: calm. That kind of calm that came from surviving things money couldn't fix. She wasn't supposed to be there. The invitation had come quietly, from a junior assistant of Sebastian's, someone who remembered late nights, coffee-stained papers, and Elena's steady voice in chaos. But the assistant hadn't known it was a setup. Aubrey had orchestrated it all, a cruel performance staged on the most opulent of stages. Because what's a queen if there's no peasant to mock? The quartet played a waltz as she walked past them. The notes were elegant, but beneath them was the low hum of disapproval. Elena stood at the far edge of the deck, where the sea met the sky. The wind tugged at her dress, her hair. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she simply stood, her gaze sweeping across the deck, not looking for approval, but taking note of faces, of betrayal, of cowardice. Then Aubrey's voice sliced through the air. "Oh my God. Who let the maid on board?" The laughter came quickly, eager, sharp, rehearsed. Guests with too much money and too little soul. Aubrey's smile was a weapon. And Sebastian, her ex-husband, the man who once whispered dreams into Elena's ear as they built an empire together, he just sipped his drink and watched. Not a word, not a blink. It wasn't always like this. Years ago, in a cramped Seattle apartment, Elena and Sebastian had built something real, from nothing. They'd turned $50 in a vision into a $20 billion company. Elena was the strategist, the night owl, the woman who took calls at 3 a.m. Negotiated with Tokyo while baking banana bread for the interns. She had miscarried at 5 months because of stress, because of Aubrey's cruel messages and Sebastian's increasing distance. And when she needed him most, he'd said, "Maybe it's for the best." That sentence never stopped echoing. She'd left with nothing. No settlement, no shares, just silence. And silence, in her case, wasn't weakness. It was war. She moved to Portugal and opened a bookstore. Small, warm, filled with artists and orphans. It made just enough to live, but it was honest. It was hers. And now she stood here, on the ship that symbolized everything she rejected. Guests began to whisper. Someone posted a photo of her shoes, captioned it, Valerian V's stray. The image spread like wildfire. Laughter spilled like overpriced champagne. Elena's presence threatened the narrative they needed that wealth equal worth. So they tried to erase her. Again. "You here for your alimony check," barked Marcus Tate. Real estate heir with nothing but arrogance in his portfolio. Someone from the crew tossed her a napkin. "You missed a spot, sweetheart." And still, Elena said nothing, because she knew this wasn't about her. Not really. It was about them, their need to diminish, their fear of what she reminded them of: effort, love, loss, rebuilding. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a mirror. But cruelty feeds itself. Mia Carter, head stewardess, smirked as she polished a champagne flute and muttered, "She thinks she's a guest." Aubrey leaned in, loud enough for drones to catch. "She came for a man, but he came for me." The quartet slowed. Something shifted. Sebastian stepped forward. "Elena," he said, voice booming, "don't embarrass yourself. I let you go out of pity. This is not your place." The deck held its breath. Then, Aubrey took it further. From her clutch, she pulled out Elena's old wedding ring, held it up, then dropped it onto the teak wood. "You drop this, or do you want to crawl for it?" The crowd roared. The photographers zoomed in. Elena looked at the ring, then at Sebastian. His smirk, his betrayal, his failure, and still she didn't move. It was too much for Aubrey. She needed the victory, the fall, the ruin. So she shoved her. Elena stumbled. Her feet scraped the edge. The sea opened below, and then she was gone. The silence was immediate, stunning. Some gasped, some laughed, some turned away. And then, from the edge of the horizon, came a roar, a speedboat, cutting through water like a blade. A man stood at the helm, dark shirt, soaked in salt, and without hesitation, he dove straight into the sea. Gasps turned into murmurs. Drones zoomed. Cameras clicked. Who was he? The sea bubbled. And then he rose, Elena in his arms. But that's not for now. This is only the beginning. They thought she would sink. But beneath the calm surface, something ancient stirred. The sea didn't just swallow her. It held her like a mother. Cold, honest. And when Elena felt the salt water close around her, it didn't scare her. It freed her. For a few seconds, there was no noise, no cameras, no insults, just silence. And that silence was sacred. It reminded her of the bookstore in Portugal. The mornings before the doors opened, when the only sound was the breath of pages waiting to be read. In those seconds underwater, the chaos on the yacht became distant. Like a past life she had already mourned. She didn't thrash. She didn't scream. She simply opened her eyes and looked up through the shimmer of sunlight breaking across the surface. She was still sinking slowly, her dress fanning around her like a ghost of the woman she used to be. But something in her heart whispered, not yet. Not like this. The arms that pulled her from the deep were strong, unfamiliar, and trembling with urgency. A man she hadn't seen in 2 years. A man she once pulled from death. His name came to her lips before she could see his face. Julian. The last time she saw him was in Morocco. A collapsed bridge. A flood. A man hidden behind the name Luca. She never knew he was Julian Marchetti, heir to a banking dynasty, an architect of power. Back then, he was just another soul lost in the mud. But in that moment, trapped in the river, he had looked at her the same way he did now, like she was the only light in a dark world. The deck erupted when they surfaced. Gasps, screams, paparazzi scrambling to adjust their lenses. Sebastian dropped his glass. Aubrey's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Julian pulled Elena up like a soldier returning from war, her soaked body clinging to his chest, her hair clinging to his face. The sun caught the diamond pin on his shirt, but his eyes only searched for hers. She coughed once, and then locked eyes with him. And in those few heartbeats, she remembered everything. Morocco had changed her. Not just the flood, not just the weeks sleeping in tents, translating for doctors, helping children sketch flowers in the dirt. It was the moment she realized she didn't need a title, a ring, or a boardroom to matter. After the divorce, she disappeared from the headlines like a whisper in the wind, no lawsuits, no interviews. While Sebastian built a new life on lies, she rebuilt hers from silence. In Portugal, she rented a corner space on an alley that smelled of seaweed and paint. She sold poetry and black coffee. She taught refugees how to write resumes. She hired two teenagers who loved graphic novels and swore they'd one day draw her story. She slept alone, and sometimes she cried. But they were tears of truth. They didn't burn like the ones Sebastian left her with. She never spoke of Julian to anyone, because Morocco wasn't a romance. It was something stranger, deeper. He was just Luca, then a man with a bruised rib and broken shoes who never told her why his eyes never blinked at money but flinched at kindness. He'd once said, "If I survive this, I'll come back." She didn't expect him to. She didn't even want him to. She only hoped he had survived and healed. Now, standing on the blood-warm deck of a yacht that dripped with cruelty, he held her like a promise. "Who did this to her?" he asked. Voice low but lethal. No one answered. Aubrey shrank. Sebastian froze. And Elena, her dress clinging to her legs, turned slowly to face them. But she didn't speak. Julian's coat slid over her shoulders. His touch was gentle, but his posture was armor. As he moved with Elena across the deck, each guest parted like a sea before a storm. Elena's shoes left wet footprints on the gold-stitched carpet. A silence followed them, terrifying, suffocating. No longer silence of disdain, but the silence of reckoning. Sebastian finally spoke. "Julian, this isn't what it looks like." "No," Julian interrupted. "It's worse. He wasn't a man known for speeches. His empire was built on silence, spreadsheets, and deals behind closed doors. But here, in front of drones, influencers, and the ghosts of every lie, he became something else. "You mock the woman who saved my life," he said. "You discarded her, but you forgot something. Dignity doesn't vanish when you delete her name from your PR narrative. Loyalty doesn't die when you change the locks. And real love doesn't bow to convenience." Guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone tried to whisper. The drone buzz grew louder. Aubrey's fingers twitched around her champagne flute. She still thought this could be salvaged with a press statement. She didn't understand yet this wasn't PR. This was truth, and truth had come in soaked cotton and a billionaire's arms. Julian turned to Elena. He knelt, antique in diamonds. His wet hair clung to his forehead. His eyes still storm-lit. "I've searched for you. I left Morocco with your name in my chest, and your courage in my blood. And every board meeting, every jet, every silence that followed was just a step toward this moment. Elena Hart, I am not here to rescue you. You don't need rescue. I am here because the only empire I want is the one built with your name." Elena's lips parted slightly, not in shock, but in breath, in memory. She remembered the night she stitched his arm with her bare hands because the clinic was too full. He'd watched her work like someone watching a sunrise. She remembered the note he left her on the last day. "Just 6 words, I owe you my breath." Luca, she had never needed a crown, but she had always deserved a choice. She took his hand not because she was weak, but because she was ready. And that terrified them. Because when a woman who's been pushed down rises with grace, she doesn't just rise, she changes the gravity around her. And everyone who once looked down now looks up afraid of what they see. The rest of the night would bring consequences. For the crew, for the guests, for Sebastian. But that was still hours away. For now, it was enough that Elena Hart stood, soaked and silent. And every cruel heart on that yacht realized they hadn't destroyed her. They had only awakened her. The hush that followed Elena's ascent from the sea didn't last long. As Julian helped her to the edge of the deck and wrapped a towel around her shoulders, the silence began to curdle. Whispers erupted in tight clusters, like smoke rising from fire just barely smothered. The kind of whispers that didn't ask what just happened, but how do we spin this? Aubrey's hands trembled now, but not from cold. Her gaze flickered between Julian and the security team, calculating every fiber of her upbringing, the prim London finishing schools, The ruthless PR strategists, the exclusive modeling contracts told her this was a media disaster, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of Elena standing like a survivor when she was meant to be a memory. The crew stood still, a thin line of tension running through them. Mia Carter's hand still held the tray she had been carrying when Elena arrived. Now, it was trembling. Ethan Pike, the deckhand who had tossed a napkin at Elena just hours ago, quietly edged toward the stairs, hoping to vanish before attention fell on him. But it was too late. Julian's voice cut through the deck like a wire. Mia, Ethan, step forward. They froze. Slowly, like school children called to the front of a class, they obeyed. The guests watched with predator curiosity, the same energy they brought to courtroom dramas and influencer meltdowns. But this was real. There were no actors, no scripts, just consequences. Julian's eyes were unreadable, but not cold. They burned with a quiet, exacting fire. You mocked a woman who had done nothing to you. You followed whispered commands because they came wrapped in satin and influence. Tell me, is that what loyalty looks like now? Ethan opened his mouth, but Julian raised a hand. Don't explain. There is no explanation that restores dignity. He turned slightly, and a man in a black suit handed him a tablet. On it, 2 digital signatures flickered to life, termination notices. Your contracts with every Marchetti vessel are null as of this moment. You will be escorted off this yacht when we dock. Mia's mouth parted, and she tried to speak, but nothing came. The weight of what she had done hit her not in words, but in the hollow stillness of her chest. Then came the investors, Victor Crane, Lydia Strauss, Gregory Lang Titans, who had laughed loudest when Elena stood dripping and quiet. Now they looked at Julian with new eyes, not as a colleague, but as a threat, a man capable of shifting not just markets, but legacies. Victor, Julian said calmly, you once called her bookstore a vanity project. Do you know what vanity looks like now? It's the mirror you all used to check your reflection after mocking a woman who built an empire. He nodded to his assistant, who displayed another screen headlines already live. Tweets exploding. Footage looping across networks. Hale Corporation, stock drops 32% in first hour after yachting scandal. Lydia's knuckles turned white around her wineglass. Julian, we can contain this if there's no if. He cut in. The footage is already out. The story's already told. You don't get to rewrite it now. Elena watched, not with triumph, but with something heavier, a solemnity. These weren't victories. They were just truths finally speaking loud enough to be heard. Her eyes scanned the crowd faces she once knew. People who shook her hand when Hale Corporation signed its first international contract. Investors who cheered her presentations and drank from glasses she'd polished herself during the startup years. Now they looked away. Not out of shame, but exposure. She knew the difference. Shame could lead to redemption. Exposure only made people hide better next time. Sebastian hadn't moved. He stood near the glass railing, his jaw tight, his champagne still in hand, though it had long gone warm. He looked not at Elena, but at the ripples still moving in the ocean, as if trying to replay what he could have said or done, to prevent what had become inevitable. But regret is a coward. It only comes once the audience turns against you. Elena approached him, not to hurt, not to humiliate, but to look him in the eye one last time without needing anything in return. No apology, no answer, just closure. You lied when you said I wasn't strong enough, she said quietly, but I don't blame you. You couldn't handle the truth of me. That's not the same as me being weak. He finally looked at her, and for the first time, something cracked in his gaze. He saw her, not the girl in the cotton dress, not the business partner he betrayed, not the wife he discarded, but the woman who had survived all of it and come back with grace. Aubrey, standing just feet away, saw that crack too, and something in her snapped. She stepped forward, heels clacking against the deck like drum beats. You think you've won? Lena, she hissed, voice shaking with fury. This is all pity. He saved you out of guilt. Elena turned, slowly, calmly. You think guilt makes a man dive into the sea before the world, she said. No, that's what courage looks like when it finally finds a purpose. Aubrey's face flushed red, but the crowd wasn't with her anymore. The influencers who had mocked Elena's dress were deleting their posts. Leah Brooks' ex account had already been suspended. A stylist nearby was whispering apologies on camera. The tide had turned, and Aubrey stood alone, a queen with no court. Security, Julian said, nodding toward her. Miss Langford will be escorted off the premises. A list of brands terminating their contracts has been forwarded to your publicist. Panic flickered in Aubrey's eyes. This wasn't just scandal. This was erasure. Her modeling contracts, her endorsements, her fashion lines all built on the illusion of power. And that illusion shattered the moment Elena stood back up. She turned to Sebastian for help, but he didn't move. Not out of cruelty, but because he had nothing left to offer. He was a man whose legacy was now dust, and dust can't hold up queens. Elena stepped away from them all, her towel now off, the sea breeze catching the ends of her dress, her canvas shoes still wet, but her back was straighter, her eyes clearer. The woman who had been called a stain on the event now stood as its only meaning. Julian joined her, not in front, not behind, beside. As they walked toward the front of the yacht, a screen lit up a live stream from Lisbon, Elena's bookstore, children painting murals on the walls, an elderly poet reading to teens, a sign over the door that read, "Every story deserves a second page." The guests watched in silence. Some wept, some clapped. Others just stared at the logo flickering on the screen, a lotus flower blooming out of a cracked stone. Julian squeezed Elena's hand gently. She didn't smile, not yet. But something softened in her shoulders, and far off, where the sky met the sea, the horizon seemed to bow just slightly, as if it too had been watching. Because this wasn't the end, this was the reckoning. The morning after the storm was quieter than anyone expected. The Valerian 5 had docked under moonlight, its once radiant decks dimmed, its staff stripped down to a skeleton crew, and the guests who hadn't already vanished into black cars and private helicopters now moved like shadows, aimless and shaken. But there was one cabin, still pulsing with light. Elena stood inside it, her hair damp from a shower, wrapped in one of Julian's monogrammed robes that felt less like luxury and more like shelter. She wasn't resting, she wasn't recovering. She was remembering, not the insults, not the plunge into the sea, or even Julian's hand pulling her back to the surface. She was remembering 2017, the moment everything truly began. In a rented WeWork office in downtown Seattle, the startup version of Hale Corporation had been nothing more than a dream stapled to a wall. Back then, Sebastian didn't have a watch worth more than their printer. His suits were bought secondhand and tailored poorly. Elena remembered folding her sleeves twice to type without catching the frayed threads. She had joined him not because she believed in him, but because she believed in the problem they were solving. A platform that streamlined microfinancing for artists, independent publishers, women in developing countries. They had worked 18-hour days fueled by cold pad thai and unspoken attraction. There was never a grand confession. Just one night when they were both too tired to go home. And Elena had fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder and woke up to find his coat over her. After that, everything unfolded with the casual certainty of people who were always meant to walk the same path until they weren't. Elena moved to the desk now and opened a drawer. Inside, a velvet box, not one she recognized. Julian had placed it there after she'd gone to shower. She hesitated before touching it. When she finally opened the lid, it wasn't a ring. It was a small key. Taped underneath was a card, written in clean, precise script, Isola de Elena, yours now. The island where we met, reborn in your name. She didn't know how to process that yet, so she didn't. She set the box down and returned to the window. Outside, Julian was speaking with several men in dark suits, clearly lawyers or security officials, but there was no aggression, no raised voices. Just the calm certainty of a man who had already moved his chess pieces 2 steps ahead of the board. She had seen this version of him before, not in Morocco, not in mud and chaos, but in the glimpses of him that bled through even when he was pretending to be someone else, the way he handled a panicking nurse, The way he carried children without flinching. The way he watched her work with that intense, unreadable gaze. He had been building something back then, just not a bank, himself. Julian stepped inside moments later, brushing the salt air from his jacket. "We dock in an hour," he said, voice soft. "There will be cameras. I can shield you from most of it." Elena didn't answer right away. She was still processing the island. The gesture, the magnitude of everything that had shifted in a single night. "I don't want shields," she finally said. "I just want the truth to speak louder than the noise." Julian gave her a look, not admiration, but recognition. He crossed the room and sat opposite her at the desk. The tension in his body, not exhaustion, but restraint. "I've known powerful people my whole life," he said quietly. "Men and women who could buy elections, ruin nations, build markets out of smoke. But none of them ever looked a boardroom in the eye the way you did last night. You made them see what they'd buried under layers of noise. You didn't scream. You didn't fight. You stood. And that was enough to make the empire shake." Elena looked at him, a faint line between her brows. "I didn't come here to burn anyone down." "Julian, I know," he said. "That's why they'll never forgive you." The car waiting for them at the dock was discreet but armored. A female driver with a Marchetti pin greeted Elena by name and opened the door without waiting for instruction. The ride through the coastal roads was slow, almost ceremonial. Locals lined some of the streets, not as tourists or fans, but citizens who had seen enough from live streams and overnight headlines to recognize a shift in the wind. A few held signs. One read, "We believe her." Another simply said, "Elena, Empire," at the entrance of a restored 16th century villa nestled into the cliffs above Positano. Julian led her through a courtyard filled with terracotta, jasmine, and silence. There was no press conference, no cameras inside, just staff who bowed and disappeared, and a table set for two. She didn't eat much, neither did he. They drank tea, not wine, spoke little, until finally, Julian set down his cup and said, "There's one thing I haven't told you about Morocco." Elena raised an eyebrow. "That night you pulled me out of the river. I told you my name was Luca because I couldn't risk being recognized. But what I didn't tell you is why I was there. I wasn't on vacation. I was trying to disappear." She leaned in slightly, sensing the weight beneath his calm. "My father had died. Suddenly, the board wanted me to take over immediately. The media was circling. Investors were pushing a hostile restructure. And I panicked. I ran. I got on a plane and didn't even tell my own team. I thought if I could be anonymous for just a week, I could figure out who I was. Then the bridge collapsed. I was in the wrong place, wrong time. But you didn't hesitate. You would have done the same." Elena said. "No," he replied softly. "I wouldn't have. Not then. I was still the kind of man who thought saving people was someone else's job. You changed that. You changed me." Elena looked down, then away. The wind carried the scent of sea salt and rosemary. "I didn't save you to be remembered. I just didn't want another name added to the list." Julian stood, paced once, then stopped. "I came back. Weeks later. You were gone. No forwarding address. Just your name scrawled on a receipt for children's books and a coffee tab." He smiled faintly. "I bought every book left in the store. I kept them in my office for a year." Elena finally met his eyes. "Why didn't you find me then?" "Because I wasn't ready to show up with the right reason. Now I am." She didn't answer. "Not yet." Because there were too many things that still needed healing, not between them, but inside her. You don't grow through betrayal by pretending it never happened. You grow by walking through its fire, barefoot, head high. Later that evening, Elena stood on the balcony overlooking the town. Lights glimmered like stars fallen to earth. She held a notebook in one hand, fingers brushing against its cover as if weighing the value of what to write next. Below, on the water, she could see the Valerian V still docked in the shadows, a floating ghost of everything false she'd left behind. Julian joined her quietly, said nothing. Just stood beside her the way he always had without expectations. "I'll take the island," she said finally. He turned to her, surprised, but on one condition. She continued, it becomes a refuge for women, for creators, for the unseen. He smiled. It already was. You just gave it a name. And in that moment, Elena knew the war was never hers to fight with fire. Her weapon had always been creation, dignity, and the power to rebuild, not revenge, restoration. That was how legacies were truly born. The sun hadn't yet risen when the world woke to Elena's name, not whispered in luxury circles or gossiped about in fashion lounges, but typed out in bold headlines, trending hashtags, and handwritten notes taped to bookstore windows across 3 continents. Elena Hart didn't fall. One post read, "She rose in silence and shook the sky." Another, from an independent journalist in New York, simply said, "Last night, we saw grace weaponized against cruelty, and grace won." The story had grown beyond scandal. It had become something else, a mirror. And in that mirror, people didn't just see Elena. They saw the parts of themselves they had buried: dignity, survival, courage that didn't roar but stood anyway. At a round table in a private room inside the Marchetti Villa, Julian scrolled through live analytics. His PR chief sat beside him, eyes wide with awe. Elena's name just passed 12 million mentions. That's more than the Super Bowl last year. Every major platform is requesting a live statement. CNN, BBC, Vogue, even Al Jazeera. The New York Times wants to feature her in the Sunday profile. Then Julian nodded but didn't look up. His mind was elsewhere, on her, on what she would want. Not just what would make headlines, but what would matter. Because this story was no longer his to control, if it ever had been. Meanwhile, Elena stood in the villa's west garden alone, surrounded by lemon trees and silence. She was not afraid, but she was thoughtful. The kind of thoughtful that comes when you realize every choice from this moment forward becomes a stone in the foundation of something far bigger than yourself. Last night had been about survival. Today was about definition. What would she say? What would she let speak for her? The robe she wore fluttered softly in the morning breeze, and her eyes scanned the horizon not for answers, but for resolve. She had it. She just needed to let it settle into her bones. She turned as footsteps approached. Julian, casual now in a black sweater and slacks, held a cup of coffee out to her. She took it wordlessly, grateful not for the caffeine, but for the gesture, for the simplicity. "They want a statement," he said after a long pause. She raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. "I told them you'd speak on your own terms. But there's one more thing. Sebastian's board has called an emergency meeting. They're debating his removal." At that, Elena finally smiled, not out of triumph, but clarity. "And let me guess," she said softly, "they'll be scrambling to offer me something now. A seat, a PR token, an apology wrapped in opportunity." Julian tilted his head. "You could take it, wield it, rebuild it." Elena shook her head. "No. That empire doesn't need me. It needs to learn to exist without feeding on people like me. I won't patch a rotting ship. I'll build a lighthouse somewhere else." Within 2 hours, Elena sat in front of a single camera. No lights, no makeup, no stylist, no teleprompter. Just her, a chair. And the truth, Julian had cleared the room. Even the crew stayed outside. She took a breath and began, "I'm not here to defend myself. Because truth doesn't require defense. It stands, and it waits for the world to catch up. I was pushed off a yacht. But the truth is I was pushed long before that off the boardroom table, out of the conversation, out of the story. I stayed quiet, not because I lacked the strength to speak, but because I wanted to understand what silence could teach me. And it taught me this dignity isn't loud, but it is powerful. You don't have to scream to change a room. Sometimes you just have to stand and not move when they tell you to disappear." She paused, then added, "If you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in the room you helped build, I want you to know your value was never measured by their approval. And your story doesn't end because they turn the page. You get to write the next chapter. So write it boldly, write it kindly, and write it in ink That clip reached 20 million views in 4 hours. The fallout was immediate and relentless. Sebastian's board voted to remove him by a landslide. Investors withdrew support en masse. Aubrey's modeling agency terminated her contract, citing gross conduct unbecoming of a representative of the brand. Multiple sponsors dropped out of her fashion lines. Her Instagram comments section was locked due to abuse. And perhaps most ironic of all, the influencer who had captioned Elena's thrift shoes as Valerian V's stray publicly apologized in tears on a live stream viewed by 500,000 people. "I thought mocking someone would make me look cool," she said, "but now I see it only made me look small." Elena, however, had no interest in vengeance. Instead, she turned her focus to the island. Isola de Elena was more than a symbolic gift. It was a physical space for transformation. In the days that followed, she flew there privately, accompanied by Julian and a small team of architects, social workers, and educators she had personally chosen. The plan to transform the island into a creative refuge for women leaving abusive corporate cultures, artists displaced by war, and youth with no access to mentorship. The design was not luxury, but sacred. Every room with a window facing sunrise, every wall lined with books and blank canvases. "This won't be a monument to my name," she told the team. "It'll be a beginning for others who've been told their names don't matter." Julian watched her from a distance, always with admiration, sometimes with quiet awe. He knew power when he saw it, but Elena's was different. It didn't demand the room's attention. It redefined the room itself. She refused a grand opening ceremony. No ribbon cutting, just a simple message carved into the stone at the entry gate. "Grace is not weakness. It is the architecture of survival." Weeks later, while the world still buzzed with stories of the scandal, Elena received a handwritten letter, no return address, no signature, just 2 lines. "You reminded me that silence can be stronger than noise. Thank you." A ghost of my own making. She didn't need to guess who sent it. She just placed it between the pages of a book called Letters to the Forgotten in her Lisbon store. That book now sat on the front table, beneath a new sign curated by Elena Hart. People visited daily, not because she was a trend, but because she was a turning point. One evening, as they watched the tide roll in on the island, Julian turned to her. "Do you ever miss it?" She looked at him. "Miss what?" "The empire you built. The spotlight, the control." She smiled gently. "You don't miss cages once you've learned to fly." He reached for her hand. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. And in the space between their fingers, something unspoken bloomed. They didn't call it love yet, because neither of them needed a label to validate the gravity pulling them toward each other. What they had was not born of romance. It was forged in fire, in silence, in redemption. And sometimes, that's more powerful than any vow ever spoken. They stood, side by side, looking out at the horizon. Elena's voice was quiet but certain. "This is only the beginning." And the sea, the ski, and the world finally ready listened. The wind that swept across Isola de Elena weeks later carried more than the salt of the Tyrrhenian Sea. It carried intention, change, renewal. It was in the way the sea brushed against the restored stones of the old monastery, now transformed into the island's sanctuary for storytellers. It was in the notes of laughter rising from the central courtyard, where young artists and survivors read poetry under orange trees. It was in the quiet presence of Elena Hart, walking barefoot through the hallways, never above the people who now called this island a chapter of their healing. But among them, she listened more than she spoke. She served tea more often than she accepted it. And still, without speaking of her fall or her rise, she became the living architecture of every lesson they came here to learn. Julian had honored his promise. He had offered the island, but not as a benefactor, as a collaborator. He stayed in the background most days, managing the logistical spine of the foundation while letting Elena define its soul. The island's programs expanded faster than anyone anticipated. Word spread not through press releases, but through whispered testimonies. A Syrian artist finally finding color again after losing her entire studio in Aleppo. A young woman from Jakarta who had fled a brutal corporate scandal and now choreographed dances based on the memories her CEO told her to erase. Every story was different, but they all began the same way: someone made them believe they were small, and they ended the same way too. They proved otherwise. One morning, as the cicadas buzzed under the rising heat, Elena received an envelope. Not digital, not official, handwritten, no signature, but she recognized the handwriting before she even opened it. It was Sebastian. The letter was 2 pages, apologetic, but not performative. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't even expect a reply. But after everything collapsed, I started digging through the archives you left behind. Your strategies, your projections, the things I once told the board were my work. I see now they were yours. I used to say you were too quiet in meetings. That's because I didn't want the room to know the ideas weren't mine. I'm sorry. I hope you build something that lives longer than any company name." She closed the letter gently and tucked it into the back of a journal. She wouldn't frame it, wouldn't share it. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be for his redemption. It would be for her freedom, and she wasn't in a rush. That afternoon, she and Julian met with a delegation from the UN's Creative Recovery Task Force. They were exploring partnerships, not out of charity, but curiosity. They'd heard how her programs combined art therapy with microenterprise coaching, how every woman who completed the 3-month residency left with not only a body of work, but a business plan to sustain it. Julian had helped secure seed funding from a quiet coalition of anonymous donors, many of whom were former elites trying to clean the dust off their legacies after being shaken by Elena's silent uprising. She never named them, never condemned them. That wasn't the point. The point was what came next. That evening, she hosted the island's first open circle. It wasn't a gala. It wasn't even a fundraiser. It was a fire-lit gathering where everyone, residents, mentors, even staff, could tell a piece of their story. No phones, no recordings, just stories, one by one. They rose. Some stammered, some cried, some laughed. Elena listened to every word, her gaze never drifting, her body never fidgeting. When it was her turn, she didn't speak about the yacht, or Sebastian, or Julian. She spoke of a foster home in coastal Oregon, a bunk bed, a social worker who told her she'd never be adopted because she asked too many questions. She spoke of the day she learned how to sit with grief without making it her identity. She told them she wasn't proud of having suffered. She was proud of having chosen to build anyway. The fire crackled. No one clapped. That wasn't the kind of story this was. But one young woman reached forward, touched her hand, and whispered, "Thank you. That's what I needed." Meanwhile, in the outside world, the media still hadn't let go. Though the frenzy had quieted, the ripples of what happened on the Valerian 5 continued to echo. A documentary team reached out, asking for rights to chronicle the rise and fall of Sebastian Hale's empire. Elena declined, but not because she feared the story being told. She just knew the real ending wasn't his fall. It was her choice to rise. That couldn't be edited for drama. Julian, too, was shifting. He had begun donating anonymously to programs he once considered irrelevant. He had declined board seats, redirected profits, and turned down a cover profile from Forbes. "If they only care because I dove in after you," he said to Elena one night. "They missed the point." She smiled. "Let them miss it. That's how we know it's real." They had grown closer. Yes, but not in the way tabloids described. There were no grand gestures, no public kisses. Their love was not spectacle. It was shelter. It was the way she left notes in his books when he was buried in strategy meetings, the way he learned how to cook eggplant, the way she liked it without ever being asked, the way they never once said "I love you" because it was already understood. Still, the world insisted on calling her a heroine, a phoenix, a symbol of dignity. She accepted none of the titles, but she did accept invitations to speak quietly to girls in schools with no air conditioning, to visit old colleagues who were rebuilding their own stories, to offer small advice in community circles hosted over soup and shared journals. She never monetized the moment, because it was never about branding. It was about belonging. One rainy afternoon, A girl no older than 12 arrived on the island with her mother. They had fled domestic abuse. The girl barely spoke. She only drew. Her first drawing was of a woman in a white cotton dress standing on a burning boat. When asked what the woman was doing, she said, "She's not afraid. She's lighting the way." Elena kept that drawing on her wall, not because it was of her, but because it reminded her what all of this was truly about. Months passed, and Elena's impact deepened, not widened. She didn't chase headlines. She chased healing. She didn't build taller walls. She built longer tables. And eventually, the world adjusted, not because she demanded it, but because she showed it how. On the anniversary of the night she was pushed overboard, Julian surprised her, not with jewelry, not with a headline, but with silence. He took her to the sea, just the two of them. No cameras, no yacht, just a small wooden boat. At the spot where she fell, he dropped a lantern into the water, not to mourn, but to mark. She asked him, "What is that for?" He said, "So no one ever forgets that some women don't drown. They rise." She didn't cry, but she held his hand, and in the water's reflection, for the first time, she didn't see a victim or a symbol. She saw herself, whole, unshaken, home. By the time autumn settled over Isola de Elena, the olive trees had turned a deeper green, and the air smelled like stories. The island had become more than a refuge. It had become a movement. Though Elena never once referred to it that way, she disliked the word. Movements made people into symbols, and symbols could be used, twisted, marketed. She didn't want to be a banner. She wanted to be a bridge, and that's what the island had become, a crossing point for lives interrupted, voices silenced, dreams buried under other people's blueprints. Now, the blueprint was being redrawn, not by one woman, but by many. There was Luma from Ghana, whose watercolors now sold to collectors in London and funded a school back home. There was Sophia from Poland, who arrived shaking with panic attacks and left reading poetry to crowds without blinking. There were children drawing murals, survivors recording podcasts, chefs rebuilding old recipes with new names. The island hummed with the quiet, powerful noise of people reclaiming themselves. Elena remained at the center, but not as a ruler. She led by listening. She guided by example. Every morning, she made her own bed. Every evening, she took tea with a different guest. She learned every name. She remembered every voice. And when asked how she kept giving so much, she always smiled and said, "I'm not giving, I'm receiving." The world outside hadn't forgotten her. In fact, it kept trying to pull her back in. TV networks offered documentary deals. Billionaire philanthropists requested partnerships. Political leaders wanted her endorsement. She said no to all of it, not out of arrogance, but clarity. The island's mission wasn't to climb ladders. It was to build new ground. And the only platform she cared to stand on was the one that let others rise beside her. One day, an old friend from her Seattle years visited the island, a former coder who had worked with her and Sebastian during the chaotic HailCorp days, before the first funding round, before the betrayal. His name was Nolan, and he arrived looking older, softer, but with the same nervous kindness she remembered. They hugged without words. And over dinner, he told her he had left the company shortly after she had. "It wasn't the same without you," he admitted. "The work was still smart, but the soul left with you." Then he paused. "Do you ever miss it?" She looked out at the horizon. "No," she said. Because this, she gestured to the candlelit courtyard where three women were laughing over a game of chess. "This is what I thought I was building back then. It just had the wrong name." That same week, she received a surprise guest. Aubrey Langford, unannounced, unexpected, unarmed. Julian intercepted her at the dock, tense but composed. She said she doesn't want cameras. He told Elena later. She came alone. Elena hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn away. But she also knew healing sometimes wore strange disguises. So she met her, not with an entourage, not with Julian beside her, but alone, under a fig tree by the North Cliff. Aubrey looked different, not smaller, not broken, just less performed. Her clothes were simple, her makeup minimal. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Aubrey said, I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I came because I finally saw the full video, not the clips, not the spin, the raw feed. I watched myself laugh as you were pushed, and I didn't recognize who I had become. Elena nodded. You became what the world told you to become. I know the script. Aubrey's eyes filled, but no tears fell. I've lost everything. The modeling, the endorsements, my reputation. Elena tilted her head. Then maybe now you have space to find who you are. They didn't hug. There was no cinematic reconciliation. But Aubrey left with a pamphlet about the island's restorative programs. And Elena didn't throw it away when she walked back to the villa. Julian asked her later if she regretted it. She said, no, closure isn't about doors slamming shut. It's about knowing you're no longer trapped into the room. Julian himself had begun spending more time off the island, not because of distance, but purpose, bahis. He traveled to Lisbon, to Marrakesh, to Seoul, setting up parallel programs inspired by Elena's model, quietly seated through Marchetti Global, but fronted by local voices. He refused press, turned down every invitation to explain himself. He wasn't interested in redemption through media. He was interested in redemption through impact. One night, as he and Elena sat by the edge of the vineyard overlooking the dark sea, he told her, I never thought I could live a life without legacy. She looked at him, and now he shrugged. Now I just want to live a life that matters, even if no one remembers my name. She touched his hand. Then you're already doing it. The next day, Elena hosted a small private circle for some of the younger women on the island. They asked her if she had any regrets. She paused, thought, then said, I regret not leaving earlier. I stayed too long in rooms where I had to earn my right to speak. I mistook silence for loyalty. And I believed that if I just worked harder, they'd finally see me. They never did. But I do, though. I see myself now. One of the girls, no older than 15, asked, do you think you'll ever go back? Elena smiled. To that world, no, but I'll build a better one beside it. And eventually, it'll have to change to keep up. Later that week, a small boat arrived carrying supplies, but also a new mural painted on the side. It showed a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, not falling, but opening her arms to the wind. Underneath, in bright blue letters, some women aren't pushed off cliffs. They leap, because there are building wings on the way down. Elena didn't know who painted it. No one claimed it, but she wept quietly when she saw it, not because it made her feel powerful, but because it made her feel understood. The island continued to bloom. Programs expanded. Survivors returned as mentors. A library was built from donated books and stories. Elena never stopped working, but her work was no longer about proving herself. It was about offering what she wished she'd had, a place to begin again, a place to believe again, a place where no one asked, what have you done before offering you a seat at the table? One night, Julian surprised her again, not with gifts, but with an old projector. Together they watched clips from Morocco, filmed by volunteers. Grainy footage of Elena helping children, laughing with strangers, hauling water barefoot across a cracked road. She watched herself as if watching someone else, then turned to Julian. Did you keep this all along? He nodded. I kept everything. I didn't want to forget the moment I met the person I wanted to become. She didn't say anything, just leaned against him. And the two sat under the stars, not as saviors, not as symbols, but as people who had learned that healing is never loud, never linear, and never final. But it is real, and it is enough. For now, the second spring on Isola de Elena arrived not with fanfare, but with the gentle insistence of renewal. Jasmine crept higher along the villa's stone walls. Birds nested in the rooftops, undisturbed by cameras or questions. And the island moved with a rhythm entirely its own, one not dictated by algorithms, trending cycles, or the approval of boardrooms. Elena stood in the garden before dawn, barefoot on dewy grass, watching light peel across the sea. She didn't think of the yacht, not anymore. That night no longer haunted her. It had simply become a doorway she once passed through. A necessary collapse, the ash from which something sacred had taken shape, and now that shape had a name, a language, a voice stronger than hers alone. The sanctuary had expanded. 6 satellite programs had been launched across the globe, each bearing the imprint of Elena's design, but carrying the soul of their own communities. In Nairobi, a group of girls who had survived child marriages now led a poetry circle that raised enough donations to build their own library. In Medellin, an old warehouse had been converted into a theater where ex-gang members told stories in monologues and music. In Laos, a floating classroom drifted down the Mekong, carrying books, chalk, and dignity. Alana hadn't visited every place. She didn't need to. She trusted the women leading them, trusted what grew when power was given, not hoarded. She never called herself a founder. She didn't like the word founders. Too often became gatekeepers. She preferred cultivator. A gardener of spaces where others could bloom, Julian had returned from another quiet trip, this time from Mumbai, where he had brokered a new mentorship exchange between artists displaced by corporate land grabs and the residents of the island. He found Elena in the garden, still silent, still grounded in ritual. He handed her a small carved elephant, a gift from a teenage girl who had made it while learning to sculpt through the program. Elena ran her fingers over the smooth contours. Did she give it a name, she asked? Yes. Julian smiled. She named it Courage in Small Things. Elena nodded. Then we'll place it in the front library. Let it greet every visitor. That same day, a letter arrived from a journalist who had once written one of the cruelest op-eds after the yacht incident. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but an acknowledgement. When I wrote about you, he said, I was performing, trying to sound clever, cynical, superior. You threatened something in me, the idea that kindness could be louder than spectacle. I see it now. I just wanted to say, I'm trying to unlearn what I thought I knew. Elena read the letter and placed it between the pages of a book on shame resilience. She didn't reply, not because she was cold, but because some lessons were best left to unfold on their own. That night, the island hosted its first reunion. Former residents returned from every continent. The air was thick with laughter, tears, music, and shared silence. People brought new partners, children, artwork, and letters. Some brought nothing but their presence, and that was more than enough. During the evening, they held a storytelling circle beneath the olive trees. No microphones, no lighting crews, just voices rising into night, one by one. Women and men spoke of who they had been, who they had become, and who they were still becoming. Elena listened, as always, with stillness and reverence, but this time, something shifted. Someone asked her to speak not just of the past, but of what came after. She hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because some truths take time to find the right shape. Then she began, there was a time, she said, when I thought healing was about getting back to who I was before the pain, but I've learned that's impossible. That version of me no longer exists. And that's not loss, it's growth. I don't want to go back. I want to move forward. We are not the stories they wrote about us. We are the ones we choose to write now. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply remain gentle in a world that tried to break you. The circle didn't applaud. They simply leaned in closer, as if her words were light and they were gathering around it for warmth. Afterward, Julian took her hand as they walked back to the villa. You know, you just reframed the entire narrative again. He said, they'll quote that line for years. She smiled. Let them. As long as it's not my face they center, let it be the fire, the soil, the hands that planted something. He stopped walking. You've always given everything away, he said, but you've kept one thing. What she asked. You've never let yourself be celebrated. Not truly. She looked up at him, the stars soft in her eyes. That's not the part of the story I'm here to play. Then let me play it for you, he said. And from his pocket, he pulled a small box, not velvet, not gold, wood, hand-carved. When she opened it, There wasn't a ring. There was a compass. Engraved on the back were the words, "Home is wherever you are brave enough to begin again." He didn't kneel. He didn't ask a question. He simply looked at her, and in that gaze was everything unsaid. Elena didn't cry. She simply closed the box and placed it over her heart. "Then let's begin again," she whispered. 3 months later, they hosted a wedding, not a spectacle, a gathering. No gowns, no press, no cathedral, just the courtyard under lanterns and laughter, surrounded by those whose stories had crossed and converged because two people chose to rise when they were told to stay silent. There were no vows recited from tradition. Elena spoke first. "I don't promise perfection," she said. "I promise presence." Julian followed. "I don't promise to protect you from pain. I promise to never let you walk through it alone." They kissed under fig trees, and the island roared with joy. The next day, a child born on the island was named Elena. Her mother, once a victim of trafficking, said, "She will carry your name not because of what happened to you, but because of what you did to with her." Elena held the child for a long time and whispered into her hair, "Grow wild, grow free." Years passed. The world changed. Empires rose and fell. New technologies emerged. Scandals faded. But the island endured, not because it resisted change, but because it had been built on what lasts: dignity, restoration, story. And whenever someone asked, "What happened to that woman who was pushed overboard?" someone else would answer, "She didn't just rise. She reached back and pulled 100 others up with her. No revenge, just legacy. No crown, just truth." And the sea, each night, whispered her story to the moon, not as tragedy, but as testimony. They thought they had sunk her, but she became the tide.